Hey everybody, welcome to Red May, your chance to take a 1-month vacation from capitalism, to riff on red, to eat red food, wear red clothes, and read Karl Marx. Today, the subject, a very timely one, unfortunately, fascism. And I'd like to introduce our moderator for the panel for Anti-Fascist Futures, Alyosha Goldstein. Alyosha is a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. He's the author of Poverty in Common, the editor of Formations of United States Colonialism, and co-editor of For Anti-Fascist Futures Against the Violence of Imperial Crisis, the book from Common Notions upon which this panel is based. Alyosha, welcome to Red May.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you to you and all of the folks at Red May for the invitation to come and be part of this. It's a real honor to have the opportunity to present our book as part of Red May. And so I want to thank everybody for joining us. We're going to be talking about the collection, which, as Phil mentioned, has an unfortunate timeliness that is ongoing. And so what I'm going to do is I want to provide just a few opening remarks in addition to introducing the panelists. And we'll start with, I'll go through and introduce each one of the panelists in the order in which they're going to speak. And they're speaking in the order that their chapters appear in the book. I'll then say a little bit about what Simone, co-editor, and I intended for our sort of primary contribution of the volume, why we think this is important, sort of reframing of questions of fascism at our current moment. And then Simone will say a few words as well, and then we'll proceed through the presentations. So as I said, we're going to have speakers in the order that they appear in the book. The first speaker will be Simone Samudzi, who's a postdoctoral research fellow with the Actions Program at the University of California, San Francisco, and a research associate at the Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. I just heard something about a new position, but I don't know if that's public or not yet, so we'll just say there's some other good news in the works. Zoe's work research engages German colonialism, the 1904 to the 1908 Ova Herero and Nama genocide and its afterlives, biomedicalization, visuality, and the institutional capture of human remains. She's the co-author of As Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions for Liberation, and a writer whose work has appeared in many outlets and is also a contributing writer for Jewish Currents. So Zoe's going to be speaking about her chapter from the book, which is entitled Reparative Futurities, Post-Colonial Materialities, and the Ova Herero and Nama Genocide. So next we'll hear from my co-editor, Simone Ventura Trujillo, who is an assistant professor in the English department at New York University. He's the author of Land Uprising, Native Story Power, and the Insurgent Horizons of Latinx Indigeneity. And he is the co-editor of the volume that we're speaking about today. Simone's chapter is Race, Cinema, and the Disorganized Crime of Fascist Devotion. Next, we'll hear from Nicole Nguyen, who's an associate professor of educational policy studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She is the author of A Curriculum of Fear, Homeland Security in U.S. Public Schools, and also the author of Suspect Communities, Anti-Muslim Racism, and the Domestic War on Terrorism, or Terror, excuse me. Nicole's chapter, co-authored with Yazan Zaza, is Make Fascism Great Again, in quotation marks, mapping the conceptual work of fascism in the war on terror. Then we'll move to a presentation by Dian Nguyen, who's Tanana Athabaskan and is an associate professor in the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's the author of Therapeutic Nations, Healing in an Age of Indigenous Human Rights, and she's also written a number of influential poems and articles. Nguyen centers her work on the effects and affects of racial capitalism and settler colonialism on Indigenous family and community health in North America, informed by 2 generations of Indigenous feminist scholarship and activism. Nguyen seeks to illuminate the ways in which Indigenous life reorganizes and resurges, making life and kin intentional in the face of colonial violence. Dian's chapter for the Anti-Fascist Futures book collection is Be Like the Wind, or Better Like Water, Resisting Racial Capitalism's Fascist Forever Wars. Then we'll move to a presentation from Alberto Toscano, who's a professor of critical theory in the Department of Sociology, the co-director for the Center of Philosophy and Critical Theory at Goldsmiths, University of London, and visiting faculty at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's the author of many books, including The Theater of Production, Philosophy and Individuation Between Kant and Deleuze, Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea, and The Cartographies of the Absolute with Jeff Kinkle. Alberto edited the 3-volume Handbook of Marxism with Sarah Ferris, Beverly Skeggs, and Svenja Bromberg. And with Brenna Bandar, he co-edited as well the just published collection of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's writings, Abolition Geography, Essays Towards Liberation. Alberto's chapter is The Returns of Racial Fascism. So, and then finally, I'll speak a bit about my chapter, which is entitled The Anti-Imperialist Horizon. So before we begin with our panelists, Simone and I wanted just to say a few words about the overall contribution that we wanted to make with the book, and by bringing together this sort of range of really crucial and insightful authors that you'll hear some of today. The book was really conceived in the midst of the ongoing escalation of authoritarian and white supremacist violence, and the kind of shock and awe moment of 2019 for those of us in the US context. That was especially kind of highlighted by the Trump administration's kind of lead up to the elections. But we were mostly struck by the way in which the discussions around so-called, what was being actually finally called fascism, really was limited in very specific ways to debates over what properly and couldn't properly called fascism and what might not be, equivocations over whether Trump was properly a fascist or not. And so our collection wanted to intervene. We felt that these debates really obscured what was actually at stake, and continues to be at stake in our present moment, rather than rehearse these sort of endless debates over the proper definition of fascism and who didn't qualify. We wanted to take seriously how and why attributions of fascism are used in specific times and places. The authors in the volume don't necessarily all use the term fascism to describe what they're writing about. In fact, we're interested in the kind of range and tensions around sort of different conceptions of authoritarianism, ways to think across definitions. But most of all, we really wanted to think cumulatively together about kind of 3 main points. And I think these points, you know, we sort of were drawn to them in 2019. Unfortunately, they, you know, each moment they're sort of reiterated in new ways. And the sort of the recent white supremacist massacre in Buffalo, the assassination of the Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, and police assault against the mourners and at her funeral, the leaked Supreme Court document about the sort of imminent attack or kind of effort to end Roe v. Wade, the Marcos Duterte electoral victory in Philippines, the spate of anti-trans and critical race theory legislation that really seems indicative of the midterm elections about to come here in the US. All of these, you know, remind us that we just sort of have this sort of repetition of these conditions. So I'm only going to speak more briefly for one more moment. I want to mention just a few of the kind of primary interventions, and then I'll hand it over to Simone, who will add a few remarks as well. I think, first of all, what we really wanted to say was to kind of highlight the importance of returning to what was the Marxist analysis of fascism put forward by people like Clara Zetkin in the 1920s, that fascism was a reactionary mass movement linked to the crises of imperialism. So at that moment, it was really an internationalist analysis of fascism that saw it as symptomatic of these crises of racial capitalism and the ever-expanding reproduction of capitalist accumulation on a world scale. So we wanted to de-exceptionalize and historically situate figures like Trump, Duterte, Modi, and conjunctures such as the European and Japanese fascisms of the 20s and 30s. We wanted to say that those authoritarians were among many a long history that were themselves actually responses to the powerful Black, Indigenous, people of color, Pan-Africanist, radical internationalist movements, and that actually challenged the narrow worldviews of white supremacism and the violence of colonization and imperialism. And we wanted the collection to highlight those contributions as absolutely decisive, really, and to say that the sort of the debates that we're so accustomed to around fascism in the US and other contexts often minimize or entirely obscure those histories. In the mid 20th century, Black diaspora scholars, writers would emphasize these are forms of violence that have been ongoing as long as there's been slavery, and as long as this goes on in terms of the kind of racial terrorism in place of colonial states like the US. Indigenous movements highlighting anti-colonialism as absolutely the only, well, not the only, but as absolutely indispensable in terms of responding to the kind of authoritarianism that fascism is equated with. So those are some of the main interventions we wanted to make. And we will hear from a few folks today who's speaking about their specific contributions. And I'll now hand things over to Simone, who will add a few words as well.
Thank you, Alyosha. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be able to discuss this really complex and kind of urgent book. I have it right here. Material copy for you to see. It's been a real, I think that at one hand, seeing a project through is it's a moment of great joy and relief, and at the same time, the conditions that led to the emergence of this project is one that's quite terrifying, right? We're still seeing the after effects and the kind of resistance of many of the kind of forms of violence that Alyosha mentioned. I just wanted to kind of just add to the really comprehensive introduction that Alyosha gave by just kind of really flagging that for us, one of the kind of key interventions that we wanted to make was to really front, as Alyosha mentioned, the work of racialized and colonized peoples as being absolutely indispensable to theorizing what anti-fascism means and has meant historically. And this meant that we had to kind of think about fascism within a much longer history of slavery, indigenous elimination, migrant punishment, violence against women and gay, lesbian, and trans people, right? So we began to kind of see the work of folks who have been racialized and colonized and gendered as non-normative as being actually really key to imagining both what a kind of analysis of fascism could look like. So in other words, to have a way of naming fascism, right? But also a way of kind of putting limits on it, right? Showing the moments where actually fascism does not work, where fascism breaks down as a ruling practice, right? And so we were really interested in this really kind of interesting paradox, rather, right, of anti-colonial movements and writers and intellectuals who are at once kind of trying to take account of the kind of the break that fascism claims to make from liberalism, and at the same time the continuities that fascism also instills with feudalism, racial slavery, indigenous elimination, and migrant punishment in particular. And so we were interested in trying to put pressure on that paradox, right? Not try to say fascism is this definitively, and this is what resistance to fascism looks like definitively, but to open up a more variegated and unsettling terrain by which we might be able to map historic ascendance and the contemporary continuance of fascism, and what an effective counter to fascism might look like, right? And an effective counter that might not look like the forms of popular mobilizations or other forms of anti-fascist practice that we're accustomed to look at over the course of the 20th century. So, and this leads to the kind of last intervention, which I think we're really interested in thinking about, which was instead of taking fascism as something that was vanquished at the end of the Second World War, we actually took fascism as a heuristic to read into the Cold War and to the post-Cold War moment, right? So instead of thinking about the rise of liberalism and as being this kind of great emancipatory, beacon, it actually became a way of kind of concealing and rendering fascist violence even more insidious and difficult to name and more violent as a result. And so the contributions that we were able to kind of cohere in the collection really speak to this contentious terrain that we're kind of naming as fascism and anti-fascism under the specter of the violence of imperial crisis. So with that said, I think this is a good time to go ahead and go into our presentations. I think Zoe is up next. I think this would be a great time to begin to let Zoe take the screen and share her insight in the chapter she has in the collection.
Thank you so much to both Alyosha and Simone. Thank you so much for including me and my work in this incredible anthology with all of these other wonderful thinkers, writers, artists, scholars. So my chapter is about the Ovaherero and Nama genocide, the genocide that occurred in present-day Namibia at the very beginning of the 20th century, as German was asserting its imperial presence in Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia, between 1884 and about 1915. And I write about the Ovaherero and Nama genocide and its importance both for just genocide historiography, the historical canon, as well as, the national political trajectory of Southwest Africa and independent Namibia, and also how we come to understand German statecraft through the rest of the 20th century, from its role in the Ottoman genocide of Armenians, Assyrians, and Pontic Greeks, as well as the Nazi genocide, of course, and then its kind of statecrafting and its identity formation after World War II, after the Nuremberg trials. And it feels really important and really prescient to talk about the Ovaherero Nama genocide for a number of reasons. But really, for me, it feels most important to really think about the central role of anti-Blackness in Western modernity, and then the foundational role of imperialism in fascist expansionism and in genocidal violence. And so my research, my dissertation research, and this chapter begins with the concept of lebensraum, which we tend to attribute to the Nazis, but actually was born out of Oscar Prischel writing in response to Darwin's Origin of the Species. And then the concept was kind of translated into geopolitics to kind of think about the state or think about these collective political entities as living organisms, as life forms that required room to exist. And so there's a biologization of the state, a biologization of all of the races, the species of people existing within them, and a kind of naturalization both of competition for space, as well as a kind of naturalization of the domination and the dominion of one group of people, an entitlement to a space over another. And so when we see what happened in Namibia, basically, it's classic settler colonialism. The Germans began to settle Southwest Africa, which was land that they were allotted after the Berlin Conference. There were indigenous people that were positioned as a kind of obstacle to this claiming over land, to this desire to create a German outpost in the colony that would resemble the metropole back in continental Europe. And the decision to exterminate these communities of people who would not willingly become kind of governable imperial subjects. And the very first thing that was done upon the October Declaration, the Declaration of Genocidal Intent, was to excise the Ovaherero and then the Nama people from German citizenship. So I think there's a really important consideration of the kind of flimsiness, really, of citizenship and national belonging. When you look at fascism, when you look at any kind of authoritarian encroachment, and the recognition that citizenship is something that is incredibly arbitrary, that there are certain kinds of people who if we think of societal fascism in the context of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, like there are certain people who have been and will always be precluded from the social contract, and other people who were written into it, but also can still be written out of it. And the recognition that the state will simply kind of manipulate whatever tools it has at its disposal in order to excise communities from the social contract, which we see with trans folks and the particular attacks on trans self-determination, the attempted destruction of families as parents are criminalized for supporting access to gender-affirming care for their kids, looking at the ways that Indigenous people were never intended to be a part of the social contract, looking at the kind of afterlife of slavery and the ways that the kind of plantationocracy in the United States was maintained through the carceral system. So there was a big kind of, or there has been a kind of long-standing debate around the ways that the Overhero and Nama genocide would be historicized in kind of German history. And it was kind of reignited last year when a historian, Dirk Moses, wrote this incredibly provocative piece called The German Catechism, in which he kind of talks about an orthodoxy in the ways that the Holocaust is understood as this kind of civilizational break, as this moment that that really made Western civilization kind of lay itself bare, and the kind of willingness to do this genocide in Europe, and that kind of fails to recognize, as Sarah writes, that what happened in Germany was a kind of practice that had been extended to all of these other colonized people around the world for centuries. And so rather than thinking of this genocide as a practice for for the Nazi genocide, as some folks have kind of articulated, which we can only claim in retrospect, right? And it's deeply ahistorical because it kind of casts the Holocaust as an inevitability, which it was not an inevitability. But it's important to understand how necropolitical moments are reinfleshed, that there was a purpose in the attempt to kill the Overhero and the Nama people, just as there was a subsequent German purpose for its genocide in Eastern Europe. A purpose for the German state, rather, and the expansion of the German state. But it's important to understand how imperial logics are transposed into different geographic spaces for different national campaigns, as well as the intimacies between anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism, both as the state locating racial others that posed existential threats to whiteness and to the kind of health and survival and the maintenance of a white supremacist state with certain biological requirements for citizenship. And so just as the kind of animating state crafting politic is land, with lebensraum, it's about finding new land, expanding these territories in order to maximize the amount of space for the nation to grow. A truly transformative notion of futurity and also of real repair must also engage the land, right? Like it has to not just be about the kind of cheap concessions that an oppressor is willing to make in the face of, decades of campaigns for reparation and repatriation and restitution. It has to be about a real rigorous engagement of the nation state and how Westphalian sovereignty always precludes Indigenous sovereignty. And so in the context of the Overhero and the Nama, we have to really problematize the post-colonial African state and see the ways that these constructions of ethnicity also continue to preclude the possibility for Indigenous self-determination, because the current nation state is responsible and implicated in the continuation of Overhero and Nama dispossession that was begun by the Germans. And so, in my piece, I talk about how they describe and they articulate their landlessness as this continuation from Germany, how they understand, having to ask white German descendant landowners for permission to bury their families on the land. And so a big part of how these communities have been articulating real reparation, not just in whatever financial package the German government is willing to give, but in real land reform, in real, in like the reparation is not just whatever mathematic the nation state has decided all of these Overherero and Nama people were worth, right? It's about what is at stake is indigenous self-determination. What is at stake is indigenous communities being able to chart out a path and chart out a future for themselves beyond what the state conceives of them, especially as the state's conception of their future is necessarily one of material deprivation, of social and cultural deprivation. And so I think, just to wrap up, I think that I guess maybe as an anarchist, my greatest concern is really looking at the state and really thinking about the ways that the state scales, transforms, and creates kind of population management campaigns for different communities that it understands as being as eroding its kind of integrity and its foundation. And yeah, I think I'll end there. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Zoe, for that really illuminating, insightful description of your chapter. I encourage everyone to read it because it's just a stunning work of critical practice. I want to just quickly discuss my contribution to the book in addition to the editorial work that I participated in. And my chapter is called Race, Cinema, and the Disorganized Crime of Fascist Devotion. And the chapter really is prompted by two kind of problematics. The first is kind of inspired by the work of Cristina Beltran and her work kind of investigating the ways in which migrant punishment in the United States in particular, and then other settler societies more generally, is actually a participatory politics. It's actually part of a participatory practice for the so-called democracies that are born out of settler colonies. And so her work in particular does a really, really incisive job of kind of locating the ways in which a kind of media complex and a kind of social media like network and just kind of the historic formation of many kind of political groups and political ideologies today stem from the kind of the joy and the pleasure and the frenzy over punishing migrant people in the United States. So that was a question that was reinvigorated for me and for a lot of people during the Trump regime in 2017. But again, I think as many people who have studied the politics of racialized immigration know that this practice is as old as the settler state itself. So this is one domain that I was trying to kind of wrap my head around, and the other domain was kind of initiated by a work that actually my former dissertation advisor Eva Chernievsky wrote in her book Neo-Citizenship, and she has this essay in it where she's trying to think about the crisis to critical practice that neoliberalism initiates for theorists, for intellectuals, for artists, and for activists, right? And her argument is essentially like what happens when kind of the presumption of something like ideology critique, which is a presumption that state power is somehow working through guises, working through like some sort of trying to put some sort of shield up to divert what's actually going on, right? So instead of, we're not punishing migrants, we're actually, trying to, save the nation or keep citizens safe. And what she locates in the kind of contemporary moment, and this is a moment that you can see specifically with Trump, is that the state has abandoned its hegemonizing mission, right? So there is no longer a kind of mission to try to rationalize the violence that it's enacting. It's just out there, spectacularized, and in complete impunity. And so and one of the arguments that Chernievsky makes is a kind of, and trying to think about this, right, is to locate what we call popular culture as perhaps opening up a different field of activity by which we can reimagine political critique in our contemporary moment. And so for my paper, or my chapter rather, I look at two films. I look at the film Children of Men, directed by Alfonso Cuarón, which was released in 2006. And I look at the film The Infiltrators, which was directed by Cristina Ibarra and Alex Rivera, and it was released in 2019. And so what I do is I look at Children of Men and the Infiltrators. For those of you who don't know, Children of Men is kind of this kind of speculative, kind of dystopian film that takes place in the future. And the idea is that humankind has lost the ability to reproduce. Like no more, we cannot make children anymore, and no one knows why. And the world has kind of devolved into kind of chaos, right? So there's apocalypse. Apparently, it's implied that New York has been taken out through kind of nuclear annihilation, that there's like been pandemics, that there's been ecological devastation. And it takes place in Britain, and the protagonist Clive Owen is this kind of jaded ex-activist, and Britain is essentially like a kind of police state, right? It's this police state that's kind of really interesting. In one sense, it's people, the citizens of England slouch around in disrepaired infrastructures, and it looks kind of really dingy and everything, but the police have the state-of-the-art forensic technology. You know, there's signs that saying that it's illegal to evade fertility tests, and it's a state more particularly where migrants are caged and incarcerated and deported aggressively, right? So the migrants in the movie are called Fugees, and the story, the premise of the story is that Clive Owen, through his kind of past, is able to connect with this activist group who have been able to locate this one woman who is pregnant, like this kind of this miraculous event, and he is tasked with trying to get her out of England into into contact with this kind of, I guess, some kind of NGO that's doing research on how to revamp human fertility. And the movie is really interesting formally because, and this is one of the arguments I make, is that in the kind of breakdown of kind of critical practice, right, what becomes really important is a kind of like aesthetics of the state, right? The state actually may give up on hegemonizing things, but they don't give up necessarily on trying to aestheticize violence, right? In particular, aestheticizing migrants as dangerous, aestheticizing migrants as sexually devious and what have you. It's part of the settler project. And so I look at the movie to kind of see how aesthetically, right? And Cuarón is famous for his use of these long interrupted takes, where aesthetically what Cuarón is doing is trying to give us this kind of snapshot of our world, but taken to some of its kind of violently logical extremes, right? Kind of, it's a police state, and citizens have lost the ability to fight, right? And what the state does is the state's job is to try to reproduce the health of fascist dominance, right? And so what's interesting is that a number of critics have talked about this, is that, there's this one moment where, as they're trying to get out of England, they actually have to break into a prison. It's called Bexhill Refugee Camp. And in the scene when they break into a prison, it evokes the Abu Ghraib tortures in Iraq in 2003. And so in my reading, I kind of locate how Cuarón's use of like aesthetically referencing the Abu Ghraib tortures in this moment figures the Abu Ghraib tortures as this kind of future dystopia of migrant control. Right. So instead of kind of an act of imperialist warfare that's used to kind of round up folks whose homelands are being invaded and to torture them for intelligence that really doesn't do anything, what you have is Cuarón using the kind of aesthetics of the Abu Ghraib torture to signify a regime of migrant punishment in the future. In other words, to kind of collapse that kind of differentiation between imperialist aggression and migrant punishment. And so it's a powerful film, but one of the things that I argue is that it's a very much embedded still in this kind of idea of a kind of liberal ideology critique. In other words, it's still embedded in this idea that state power needs to be critically scrutinized and unmasked in order for the truth to arrive, right? And so what I do is I read as a counterpart, Cristina Ibarra's and Alex Rivera's The Infiltrators. And this is actually really interesting because their movie is a kind of hybrid film that tracks the kind of activities of dreamer activists in the late 20th century who are trying to get people out of immigration prison. And so it's a hybrid film in the sense that it started out as a documentary where they were trying to just track and follow different Dreamer activists as they were doing these mobilizations, but they realized that the Dreamer activists were doing things that were really innovative and had a lot of ingenuity. And one of the things they were doing was actually breaking into prison to bring out activists. And so they couldn't go into the prison to do their film. So in the making of this documentary, Christine Ibarra asked, how do you document something that's supposed to be hidden, right? So they turned to this dramatic reenactment to make this kind of different hybrid film. And instead of creating state power as something that an individual spectator passively can like unveil, right, through the film itself, what the film actually does is it opens up ways of thinking about cinematic production and aesthetic practice as tied to popular mobilization, specifically youth-led popular mobilization against migrant detention, right? So part of my work is trying to locate the interconnection between popular culture, aesthetics, migrant punishment, and popular mobilization against fascist violence against migrant people. So I hope that was somewhat intelligible, but I think I'll end there and go and shift it over to the next presenter.
Thanks, Simone, for that great contribution. So for my contribution, which was done in collaboration with Yazin Zaza, we wanted to follow the fascist label to understand how the US public, how world leaders were applying the term, and then the sort of conceptual work the label was called to undertake by applying it to different world leaders. And this follows some of my earlier work on how the terrorist label has been used to delegitimize and depoliticize certain forms of armed resistance waged by non-state actors. We can think here of Palestinians resisting Israeli occupation, while at the same time also dehistoricizing and decontextualizing political violence, which we see in the recent Buffalo shooting, which has been described as the work of a lone wolf terrorist radicalized by Tucker Carlson and his propagation of the Great Replacement conspiracy, which kind of erases a 200-year history of policies, practices, and logics predicated on the concept of the Great Replacement, which has been normalized and institutionalized in far less spectacular and more mundane ways that sort of reproduce the premature death of Black folks in the United States. And for me, this is important to understand sort of the conceptual work the terrorist label, the fascist label is called to undertake. And it's more than a mere academic exercise, because how we understand, in this case, political violence shapes how we then respond to that violence. So in the case of Buffalo, we see how this concept of racial individualism that's being used to understand a white supremacist shooting obfuscates the inherently systemic nature of racism in the US, such that racial violence perpetrated by individual actors is seen as a psychological or ideological issue rather than a manifestation of structural inequality in the US. And we can see this then, our response is calls for more domestic terrorism legislation, calls for more hate crimes legislation, essentially more tools in the criminal legal system's toolkit, which strengthens the very institutions that criminalize, stalk, and kill Black folks in the United States. So we can see how treating white supremacy, addressing white supremacy in its most extreme forms, in these violent hate crimes, this approach individualizes white supremacy and reduces racism to a personal problem rooted in individual pathologies, ideological beliefs, rather than in structural inequalities. So does taking Tucker Carlson off the air rid the United States of anti-Black logics, practices, and structures? Does charging a white supremacist with a hate crime change the social structures and cultural institutions in vigilante violence that maintain, confer, and reproduce white supremacy? So we see how the terrorism label flattens our analyses, and that this is an important part of the conceptual work the label is called to do. And so we wanted to think through the fascist label in the same way. And we sort of, in our approach, we understand how marking Trump as a fascist president served as an indictment of his harmful rhetoric and his policies, that it served as a rallying cry to challenge his administration, and really was a sort of desperate effort to kind of make sense of a political moment that seemed to defy all historical conventions. And some might remember, so the title of the book comes from this reinterpretation of Trump's campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," as this political allegation, "Make fascism great again." And so it's in this context, this way that sort of popular media sort of latched onto this fascist label, that then Senator Joe Biden's 2020 presidential bid was actually framed as a vote against fascism. That was one of the taglines, as a way to overcome what Biden was describing as a season of darkness. So if President Trump was an aberration from business as usual in U.S. governance, President Biden could return the country to its rightful state, or what Biden was saying, simple decency, regardless of his own troubling record on immigration, on war, policing, and civil rights. So in fact, Biden promised that he would be a, quote, ally of the light, not of the darkness. But others, of course, viewed a Biden administration as a continuation of U.S. governance, and therefore refused to see the Trump administration as a mere season or blip in U.S. governance. So part of what we argue in the chapter is that the term fascism has been mobilized to delegitimize certain forms of U.S. war, empire, and security, like Trump's proposed Build the Wall, Enforce the Law Act, while also authorizing outwardly liberal manifestations of imperial power, such as President Obama's deportation machine that turbocharged immigration enforcement. So for us, the desire to define Trump as a fascist ruler has exceptionalized his administration and its brutality, thereby essentially erasing other forms of violence and death dealing the United States has employed, irrespective of its political administration, and therefore really undermines a robust political analysis and political response. So we sort of, in the chapter, we walk through a number of different cases to kind of make sense of this tension between sort of delegitimizing certain forms of U.S. empire while authorizing these other forms of empire. So some of the cases, in addition to immigration, we look at the U.S. Approach to Iran. So we look at how Biden, in his first month in office, initiated airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias in Syria to send a message to Iran, while President Trump, assassinated Qasem Soleimani and was punished for it. Congress took action to rein in presidential powers. So again, it's this dehistoricizing, even though sort of presidential administrations have sought to destabilize and dismantle Iran through a number of different interventions, military campaigns, economic sanctions. It's only Trump's sort of direct assassination of a political leader, of a military officer, that sort of gets coded as a deviation from quote unquote American values. We also look at this in terms of anti-terrorism initiatives. So the way that President Biden's national security policies have been seen as a deviation, as a liberal alternative to President Bush's use of torture, Obama's use of torture, Trump's targeting of Muslims through the Muslim ban, through the targeting of quote unquote radical Islamic extremism, and so on. So again, Biden is continuing many of the policies that his predecessors initiated, but he is seen as someone who's sort of returning civil liberties and civil rights to Muslim communities and conferring those rights. So we walk through a number of different cases that sort of showcase how U.S. policies and practices have essentially been the same across history, but get exceptionalized under the Trump administration, in order to authorize these sort of more liberal manifestations of U.S. power. And then the last thing we do in the chapter essentially is to show how then the United States then applies the fascist label to certain world leaders to justify our own sort of use of military interventions, economic sanctions, and so on. And so, for example, we see how both, or I guess, the Obama, the Trump, and the Biden administrations all have attacked Syria to punish but not entirely deposed proto-fascist Bashar al-Assad. And so we can see how we ourselves mobilize the fascist label to mark certain countries and world leaders as tyrannical, as terrorist, as despotic, to legitimize military campaigns in places like Afghanistan, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Somalia, and so on. So for us, the term fascism obscures more than it clarifies, because the concept of fascism absolves the United States of its role, of its oppressive forms of governance, by defining Trump as an aberration rather than a continuation of political practices and ideals that have justified state-sponsored violence across political presidential administrations, while also marking certain world leaders as fascist to justify those very same military incursions and engagements. Yeah, so on there. Thank you.
Duinta, it's good to be with you here today. Thank you, Alyosha and Simone and all the presenters and the Red May crew for inviting us here today. I also want to thank Zoe specifically for giving us a really good example of an indigenous place and a different context and a different time. There's one more in our volume that was published by Ann Spice, who is Kwanlin Dun First Nation. And those people are protecting Wet'suwet'en lands at this point in time. So that's what's happening right now. And my chapter, Be Like the Wind or Better Like Water, actually is almost a memory piece in the beginning, because it wants to visit a specific organizing era that I participated in Portland in 1980, in the 1980s, late 1970s, and throughout the 1980s. And the point of bringing this old experience up for this volume was the fact that it was good to try to understand how we understood our own organizing, or the politics of our own organizing at that time, and also our own confrontation with skinheads who were being called fascists, and how we understood that particular kinds of violence, and also what was the role of our urban organizing, which was absolutely in support of people who were struggling, having specific struggles as land defenders at that time, and what was our role and understanding of doing that. So that was the point of my chapter, or the beginning point of my chapter. But you know, we didn't use the word fascist as much among the peoples that I organized with, but what we did understand is real specific to the way in which Ann Spice talks about it in her chapter, and some of the ways that Zoe talked about it in their chapter, and also from our experiences. And our experiences with fascism, something that we might be calling fascism at this point, for me, could never be differentiated from what we understood as colonization in our own moment in time in the 1980s. And as I have, continued to work as an anti-racist, anti-colonization scholar over the last 30 years, there's something that, racial capitalization, settler colonialism, all these words that were coming up with always just goes back to what are the specific acts, what is the active experiences of people who are under this kind of regimes. And so these are very ancient. They're very ancient. It's our first encounters with Europe, and we don't differentiate from them So, like, for instance, when Anne Spice says in her chapter, here is the thing that is fascist about it. We never consented to be governed in this way, and our old ways were not allowed. No amount of recognition will give us back our autonomy, will bring back the millions lost to war and disease, will give us back the children stolen and assimilated, will convince us that this new democracy will ever give us any more freedom. And um, I I jotted down, our experience understands this as a feature, not an aberration of capitalist democracies. And that doesn't need a spectacular example. It is the overall consignment of death due to wearing out, the poverty, the mental stress from a million racist acts, the embodied environmental violence that ranges from disorder and domestic lateral violences to the utter abandonment and or destruction of our means of reproducing ourselves, our life ways. And today, we share this really deep intergenerational knowledge of the morphing of these forms and powers through different racial technologies. And so indigeneity gets lost in this sometimes. And what I tried to also achieve in the chapter was to join from a question that Ruth Gilmore asks, and that's the question of we just can't change one thing. We have to change everything. And I was challenged and wanted to join in the conversation around that because I felt like there was many things that indigeneity is misunderstood. Indigeneity is actually something that exists beyond and before our racializations as Indians or our racialization in other places as Black or our racialization as other period. And underneath those racializations also is a form. It's actually a form of governance that has always been anti-capitalist. And so that was what we understood in any period of time that I can reiterate an example from. I have to always reiterate that the ways in which we have been self-defensive or have tried to build or have tried to share or in this particular point in time extremely urbanized as so many of our peoples are. What is it that we have to give to this conversation? So that was maybe one of the other and deeper quests that I had when I wrote the chapter. I'm like at this point really proud because there's a whole number of Indigenous scholars that are coming up with and speaking at this point with and trying to understand more deeply what their role is in speaking, in having relations, which we've had many relations over many generations with people who had Marxist analysis. And so some of those encounters have been humorous, and I'd like to write more about it. But they're also informative because indigeneity itself is, I could say I'm not a socialist, I could say I'm not a capitalist, and maybe I'm not a Marxist. I'd say I'm an indigenist. And that's what I've always said, which doesn't mean that I'm devoid of good Marxist analysis. It just means that I have a particular kind of position. And I put it into this history, and I feel like that one of the things extremely that comes to mind right now that we organized from was the issue around these militias that have always been present. And they've been present always on the land, organized or unorganized, as the average citizen that is there to police us, that takes part in the policing, that actually is a part of the greater policing, that keeps us from having being able to live our full lives. So I invite conversation on what I've shared with you, and thank you very much.
Well, it's a real pleasure and an honor to be in such great company. And thanks so much to Alyosha and Simone for allowing me to join this collective conversation with such an impressive range of scholars and activists, and obviously to Red May for making our meeting possible at last. So I just wanted to draw out maybe a few schematic points from my contribution to For Anti-Fascist Futures, and principally to say why I think that it's so vital to draw, among others, on an archive of Black radical theories of fascism in order to unsettle, displace, and critique the contemporary trend in mainstream and indeed liberal debates on fascism, some of which was already, I think, quite pointedly set out by Nicole. In a nutshell, I think most of the contemporary debate, especially in an Anglo-American scene and catalyzed by the 2016 election, has taken place around a familiar genre in discussions of fascism, which is that of analogy, in a sense analogy joined by exception. So usually we are confronted by debates that take the form of identifying a checklist of features that will allow us to define a particular political figure or political phenomenon as fascist, or if not a checklist, a set of steps that allows us to foresee and forestall the drive to or the tendency towards fascism. Drawing on and in many sense being inspired by Cedric Robinson's effort in a couple of essays, and actually in an unpublished book manuscript on Black radical theories of fascism, to think against the grain of this analogical and kind of exceptional narrative. I tried in the paper and in some related and forthcoming work to think through the ways in which fascism played such a significant role in the thinking of a whole set of figures within a Black radical theoretical tradition, from George Padmore and Walter Rodney's writings on colonial fascism to what Amiri Baraka called Du Bois's analysis of racial fascism in Black Reconstruction, and on to the 1970s debates, especially the ones circulating in the writings and struggles of Black political prisoners like Angela Davis and George Jackson. And I think from these debates, I would like to draw just four quick aspects, four quick dimensions of these contributions. One, which I think has already been alluded to, is to think of fascism not as a intra-European exception, but in a much longer history of racial capitalism and of settler colonialism. That is to say, and this is something that's stated very forcefully by Baraka with reference to Du Bois's work, the notion that all of the features that are often ascribed to fascism in those liberal checklists were, of course, not just present in especially the United States that counter-revolution of property that was a struggle against Reconstruction. But we're also, of course, as some recent scholarship, including the Whitman's book, Hitler's American Model, have pointed out, were in many sense inspiring to fascist interwar European movements, both German, Italian, and otherwise. And that is one, this question of a kind of fascist longue durée that precedes and follows the seemingly close exception of intra-European fascism, is one of the angles to which I think one can respond to Robinson's claim that, as he put it in his manuscript to this unfinished book on fascism, Western intellectuals manicured the genealogy of race. And that is also the reason why I think that, contrary to those who see the debates of the 1970s on new fascisms as, the kind of height of the use of fascism as simply a kind of pejorative term, I think we still have a lot to learn from those debates, not just in the US context, but globally. The second point that I think is vital for our own purposes from these debates is the notion that fascism is differentially experienced across axes of domination and racialization. And that what might appear and might be experienced from one side of the color line as a liberal regime might have many, if not most, or perhaps all of the features of fascist politics from a different perspective, albeit in the same place or the same territory. So again, that notion of the horror of the exception is then offset by the experience of those for whom the state has been a state of racial terror, even as it was a state of liberal freedoms for others. This is, in a sense, the counterpart to, Aimé Césaire's famous claims in Discourse of Colonialism that, the Europe was shocked at finding in its own territory that which it had perpetrated abroad for decades and centuries. That kind of realization can also be a realization that takes place, in a sense, kind of in situ. The third point, and I think that's perhaps the most analytically complicated, but maybe significant, perhaps also for our discussions to think about, is the question of what happens with the notion of fascism as a reaction or reactionary politics, a politics that responds to movements for liberation and emancipation, as we've inherited it from Marxist, but also anarchist traditions of thought, if viewed from the standpoint of this archive of Black radical theories of fascism that I wanted to mention. And here I found it very stimulating to think through a formulation that in her dialogues, in part with George Jackson, Angela Davis puts forward, which is this idea also formulated at the same time and in conjunction with the Davis by Herbert Marcuse, of fascism as a preventive counter-revolution, or what they also call a kind of incipient fascism. That is to say, not a fascism that responds to an immediate revolutionary threat, or even to a revolution that has been already suffered setbacks or defeats, as was the case in Europe. After all, fascism came on the scene after, and in the German case, long after the defeat of revolutionary movements in 1919. In that case, here instead, Davis identified, around 1970, the notion that a fascism of a state fascism, or fascism as or a fascization process as part of a state employing racial terror, especially in the context of the imprisonment of political prisoners, was functioning in a preventive form. And I think it's interesting to take this theory into our own conjuncture, because in many ways the fascistic ideations and processes of the present, especially as they take shape in so-called theories like the Great Replacement, or indeed the elite moral, political, and racial panics around critical race theory or cultural Marxism, etc., is not even, in a sense, a preventive counter-revolution. In some sense, it's a kind of preventive counter-reform. What it seems to move against are, in many ways, not at all revolutionary processes, even if one's extremely threatening to a certain racial imaginary. And fourth, and lastly, and I'll just say this very briefly, I think there's also a very important contribution that I didn't really foreground sufficiently in my piece, which has to do with the attention by Black radical theorists of fascism to the kind of intimate and planetary catastrophe that is the defense of what Du Bois famously called personal whiteness. And here I just wanted to finish with a quote from a remarkable text by a Martinican communist and surrealist writer, Pierre Yoyot, who wrote a book called an essay called The Anti-Fascist Significance of Surrealism in 1934, which you can find in a wonderful collection by Robin Kelly and Franklin Rosemont called Black, Brown, and Beige, where he talks about fascism as a counter-revolution of emotions and ideals, using effectively the local and historical aggravations of psychological misery. And I think the articulation of those structural dimensions and those dimensions of what Yoyot called psychological misery is at least one among the tasks for our contemporary analysis. So I will now pass the proverbial mic over to Alyosha to finish our presentations.
Thank you. I was told I was muted, which I was. So clearly a little technological bump there. Anyway, so thank you very much, Alberto, and thanks to everyone of our contributors who have spoken. As you can see, or I think get a pretty good sense of, there are some very sort of thorough through lines, the kind of points that we kind of recur throughout the contributions to the volume. I'm going to keep my remarks fairly short, just so we have time for collective discussion and questions. But I would just want to say a little bit about my piece, which is the sort of closing essay in the volume. And in my piece, what I do is I sort of come back to some of the points that we've raised, that Simone and I raised in our introduction, and also try to situate this sort of meditation on the sort of conditions, again, without sort of trying to kind of finalize a certain position on what is and isn't fascism, but really to take this as a kind of broader ensemble of reactionary authoritarianisms tied to crises of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, to try to underscore in this sort of final chapter both what Alberto was just talking about, the ways in which those forms of revanchism are historically always determined as responses. They're counter-revolutionary, counter-reform. I think they're related to something Manu Karuka calls in another context counter-sovereignty, in the ways in which colonization and imperialism is practiced. In emphasizing those counter-formations, to see the importance and the centrality of movements of liberation struggles that are ongoing. So at different moments, those responses take different forms, but as opposed to seeing forms of resistance by social movements as themselves somehow always only responding to conditions of violence, brutality, exploitation, to see those conditions of power that seek to organize colonization, capital accumulation in particular ways, to see those as necessarily responding to the unruly circumstances that they seek to order and exploit in particular ways, and the ways in which the subordination of racialized and colonized people are at the core of that. So to understand both that, and then also the sort of broader context that I think you see everyone who's spoken to, or aspects of this being gestured towards throughout what people just said this morning, that the sort of the expanded frame being absolutely crucial. Understanding the kind of the global context, the interconnections, is the sort of the fundamental stakes that my concluding chapter really is an effort to underscore that that expanded horizon as what is in a sense foreclosed by these sort of liberal nationalist responses, the way in which Nicole was speaking in particular. Say if we take Biden's campaign and ongoing ways in which he uses Trump as a foil for some sort of aberration against his proper representation of, or forwarding of, multicultural democracy, liberal democracy, that the continuities of these projects of a Biden to Trump to, really all presidential administrations, and the kind of the ongoing formation Constitution of the United States as one example, are enacted not only in these sort of national terms, but are always bound up with these broader horizons of white supremacist imperial formations. And so my concluding chapter really is an effort to underscore the movements that are radical internationalists' efforts to build coalitions across differences of location, differences of particular frameworks of subordination, exploitation, and dispossession, to think about how those responses necessarily need to understand themselves as interconnected and build those alliances. And so one of the things that I try to take up in the concluding chapter is to foreground Indigenous movements as something that in some sense has fallen out or gets marginalized in its own way. So the importance of thinking something like Pan-Africanism, the communist internationalism of the 20s and 30s, global decolonization, in conjunction with Indigenous anti-colonial movements, and to see the ways in which the terms of those shift. They don't line up exactly, and those differences really matter. But that in order to understand that kind of broader context, and in order to have tools for organizing and building collective action in our present, we really absolutely have to think and understand the specifically Indigenous contexts of the dispossession of colonization. So to think really, again, going back to what Dian was saying, to think about these forms of revanchist authoritarianism, what some call fascism, others, qualify in particular important ways, but nonetheless, as always bound up with these longer histories of enslavement, racialized terror, and colonization. That is the history to which the sort of coalitions that respond in our present moment must respond. And so I think my piece is in some way just intended to draw out and speak to some of the points that other folks have already raised, but it's also really intended to see the collection that we offer to you as a resource for how do we, without erasing or subordinating differences across peoples, places, times, understand how those interconnections are absolutely at the core of building movements for liberation now. So that's really what I think, in some sense, I hope that the collection offers is a way to think about our moment as a time in which we can draw on the tools of movements that have come before us, of movements that are underway, in ways that actually recognize, acknowledge, respect the differences across places, peoples, and times, but also draw on the common ways in which we together collectively confront global capitalism, empire, colonization, racial terror, white supremacy. And that's, I think, in some sense, the task at hand that we in some sense, are working to kind of imagine and implement in our own moment. And so I think I'll end there so that we have time for questions. I think Phil might be coming back for a moment to speak to you all about Red May, and then we'll have time to have some conversation across the different speakers, between us, amongst us, bring in questions from the audience. And again, I just want to say how much I appreciate all of the folks that contributed to the volume that we're in conversation with here. This is a collective project of building liberation together. And so thank you all.
Thank you, Alyosha, and all the presenters. There is a lot to talk about and think about in what was said. There will also be a lot to talk about and think about in the events that we have upcoming in Red May, and I just want to clue you in to a few of them. We're entering a period where we have 2 events a day, which is pretty insane for us who put it on, but is a lot of fun anyway. And at 3 p.m. today, we have America's unipolar moment, which is an examination of the absolutely botched job, or was it botched, that the U.S. Forces have exhibited during the so-called Fukuyama age. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., we have the feminist subversion of the economy with Amaya Perez Orozco, who's written a book of the same name, and Veronica Gago will be on that panel with Liz Mason-Dees, Kathy Weiss moderating. And at 3 p.m., States of Incarceration, Jared Shanahan comes back to Red May to talk with Shimon Salem and Jandarka Kurti, who's also co-author of that book. That's at 11. I'm sorry, that's at 3 on Friday. And on Saturday at 11 a.m., 2 or 3 things I know about Brecht with Tom Kuhn, who is the translator of the most recent volume of collected poetry by Brecht, Todd Cronin, Asad Haider, myself, and Asma Abbas. At 3 p.m., The Impasse of the Latin American Left, titled Jeffrey Weber's new book. He's going to talk about the book with Karen Ben Ezra, Andrea Marston, and Alejo Stark. I'm sorry, and Martin Arboleda. My bad there. And then on Sunday at 11 a.m., Art, Value, and Labor with Dave Beach, Jasper Burns, Lee Claire LaBerge, Matt Browning is moderator. So a lot of good stuff coming on. How do we do it? We do not get government support as a commie festival, obviously, or any kind of institutional support. So we depend on contributions. You can go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and you'll find a place to become a patron in our Patreon, or there's a button for Fan the Flames of Red May. It's our GoFundMe. You can do a one-time donation. So please give generously if you like what we're doing, and let's get back to the question period now.
Thanks so much, Phil, and again, so much appreciation to all that you all do. This is just a wonderful gathering, and such an important set of conversations. Incredible span of work that you bring together here. So I thought maybe we could just begin by if folks have anything you want to respond to, remarks that other speakers raised. We could begin with that. If anyone has some immediate thoughts. And remember that if you have to unmute yourself. because this is the thing that I'm worst at as a teacher, as asking the question and then letting silence do its own work. I'm going to jump in and ask a question, which I know it's better to actually just allow the conversation to unfold, but nevertheless, I'm going to jump in with the question. And which is, so I do think that one thing that we've kind of seen are the sort of the particular, I mean, something we try to emphasize with the collection are the kind of particular genealogies, histories of sort of anti-Blackness, of anti-indigeneity, of the sort of the carceral regimes that kind of manifest from everything from migration, the kind of policing and punishment of migrants, to the various forms that Nicole was talking about. I'm wondering if, in terms folks can think about in terms of their own work, how it might connect to remarks. This was done somewhat, and some of you already spoke to this, but making connections to what some of the other speakers raised, thinking about those connections, again, and an investment in sort of how do we think across difference, how do we build while still understanding the real importance differences, but like, you know, to center questions like anti-Blackness, not questions, but, you know, visceral violent regimes that are ongoing and implemented in different ways.
I can just say a little bit, because one of the things I was really struck by was, especially with Zoe and Diane, and even your presentation, was the kind of the reminder and the kind of activation of indigeneity as being both before and beyond, right, what we consider to be fascist domination and even kind of capitalist accumulation. And so I think that the question of indigeneity, I think, also speaks a little bit to the part that Alberto concluded on, which was this really great, I've never heard about this text, so I have to read that, about the anti-fascist significance of realism. Is that correct, Alberto? Okay. Because there is something that I get in wow, okay, yeah, okay. I have homework. But the question of indigeneity is both not only being a mode of governance, but also being a mode of affect, or a mode of relationality, right? A mode of relating and having emotions and interconnection, not only with people, but with broader networks of more than human life. And so I think that this is, you know, the kind of, the alarm bells are ringing in the current moment, right? And what Indigenous activists have been telling us for a long time, right, is that, you know, thinking about indigeneity, the protection of indigenous waters and lands and bodies is the thing, right, that will actually allow for these other configurations to also emerge, right? So I think one of the things that this question, I think, so I guess this question hits at, or I guess my thoughts are hitting at what's the term in our title, which is the question of futurity, right? And the question of what it means to kind of labor for a future that is not premised upon the right to pillage or the right to occupy. And so that's a question of governance, right? But that's also a question that, but that question of governance that's invoked by indigeneity is also not a matter of the state. It's not a statist form of governance, right? And it's, so I guess that's why the question of affect, the question of relationality, the question of all these things that we don't necessarily see as consolidated under governance occur. Diane?
I'll unmute. Yeah. And that's what I tried to articulate a little bit more, but I'm still writing on this right now, and I've been writing on it for a few years. I've tried to write about it as an ethos, even to try to get away from the territoriality that is always misunderstood. And when I mentioned it today as a form of governance, it's a suggestive thing about it produces an order, but what is it? And what I argue is that our places produce an order because we're from some place. And taking, you know, some hints from Coulthard's, you know, over the years has really articulated place as a set of relations. And it's a really dense set of relations, but it's also a dense set of relations that changes in time. You know what I'm saying? It's not static. And so these are forms of relations that form particular disciplines by just the aspects of whether or not the land still can support life there, not just for indigenous peoples, but for everyone. And also, what does it take to actually live there non-violently? And I don't mean not take up self-defense. Obviously, I participated in that. But what I'm saying is that it doesn't necessarily have to produce, like you're saying, a way of always of trying to subject other folks. It's a way in which what I'm looking at is the potential of making relations that recognize the relations that are already in place and the historical responsibilities to them. And so that those people who are joined in these places that have these long histories of subjection might make new relations together. That's what I'm interested in. And that's what I didn't articulate very well in the moments that I had to speak. But I am here, reaching out to everyone here to comment on that if they would like.
I mean, if I could share, I mean, something that I really appreciated a few years ago, I went up to Toronto and there was this really great, there's a public facing aspect and then a kind of private aspect of Black Indigenous, Black non-Indigenous, and then non-Black Indigenous folks all kind of coming together to think about, what it means to kind of share a really kind of intimate experience of historical violence in North America, right? With this replacement of, the importation of African, enslaved people, the clearing of land in the of indigenous land in the South to create the kind of plantationist scene. And something that I really appreciate, to your point of thinking about making relation, is this idea of kinship and kinship as a kind of really critical unit of relation, of solidarity that kind of transcends all of these kind of capitalist forms and kind of capitalist unit of relationality that kind of can transcend nuclearity and this idea of the family that is being regulated and has been regulated by the state, that transcends this idea of citizenship and rejects the kind of impositions of borders and instead thinks about different kinds of relationships to the land that are not born out of border making and extraction, and then of course rejecting this idea of settler statecraft. And I really appreciate your contribution, Dian, and your comments and just kind of really regrounding us in that. And that's something also that, writing about and following the struggles of the Ovaherero and the Nama as they're kind of, on one hand, making these demands of the German government while also never losing sight of the fact that like what has been and has always been on the table is their self-determination, has been their land, has been the ways that the Namibian state aspires to erase them from critical parts of history, erase or celebrate parts of their resistance, and then refuse their political participation, the representation of, indigenous organizing, not indigenous organizing of their kind of like indigenous cultural, social, and political formations. And so always training our attention on the way that the state attempts to kind of regulate and foreclose life and relationality, and to really lean hard into these other ways of making relation that does not rely on these kind of normative understandings of ourselves and one another.
Brilliantly stated. Thank you. I'm really happy you got to participate up in Toronto, because I heard some part of that and wish I'd had been there.
It was amazing. I cried, I think. It was great.
I know.
I'll just say one just quick thing because I think it's so important to underscore also, like just that the ways in which there are times when sort of frameworks of indigeneity have been deployed in such a way that they don't acknowledge like African indigeneities or indigeneities outside of the Americas, and I think that's one of the sort of real I think conversations like what Zoe and Dian, you just both spoke about, are ways to kind of think beyond those impasses, really, to actually address like what those complexities are and not be kind of stuck at an impasse, but really to understand the kind of entanglements of those histories as the kind of diasporic, again, how indigeneity moves and travels as much as anything else. And all of those things, I think, are so crucial to think together with in order to have the means for collective struggle on a global scale, because we have to recognize those sort of particularities at the same time, the connections. So.
No, I think that's actually a really key point, because I think that this reminds me of a point that Bettina Nguyen makes in one of her essays on the comparative, like thinking about Blackness and indigeneity. And she makes this really interesting comment about that. One of the things that Blackness brings to indigeneity is the question of freedom, right? It actually asks indigeneity to theorize freedom in a specific way. And it opens up that question of movement, right? And I think that the question of movement is also really key for indigenous sovereignty, that indigenous sovereignty is always about the right to move, right? The freedom to move, right? And so I think that this is, I mean, what this is getting us is just another way to kind of think about how to understand what has been narrated as an impasse in some certain critical scholarship, right? But that actually might be a kind of an opening for a different, I think, as Zoe put it, a different mode of thinking about kinship, a different mode of thinking about movement and kinship as being tied up with the kind of struggle against fascism. So I don't know, your comment just made me think about this, Alyosha, as in relationship to everyone else's.
I would just say something real quickly, Simone. Basically, yeah, there's histories in which where people only understand themselves in terms of what their carceral, space is to a certain extent, and that people are having a better understanding, what I'm saying, of what again, what people are seeking life, they're seeking to try to hang on to life or what have you. And I was already an adult when they made us into corporations. And so I have a really different history than some other folks in terms of trying to differentiate who we are or where we were from or what we do from the capitalist form that was imposed upon us in Alaska. And so, and was already had been radicalized in a different place and had an urban experience of organizing with all kinds of other different indigenous peoples. So I already knew that we actually were represented, if anything, a diversity. And then I even understood more deeply later on that it wasn't an identity. It's not a racial identity. It's not an identity. It's a practice. And that's where it frees us up, because it makes me be able to understand absolutely what the historical experiences that Zoe spoke of in Namibia and of all of our different places, and that we weren't never static necessarily any more than other human beings. So I just think we have a lot to talk about, you know what I'm saying, and not get some of the things about the way in which we organized in the 60s have left, the absolute nationalism, you know what I'm saying, that we espoused in the 60s. I know it really well. I helped put it into place. So, you know what I'm saying? But I'm also someone who actually argues that we need a different and more rich conversation around what that produced and why it has failed us in many cases as an organizational ploy.
I'm curious if Nicole or Alberto, if you have thoughts on these questions.
Well, I think, I mean, it's this extremely rich and extremely timely conversation. I suppose the one thing that it did make me reflect on was something I find very difficult to confront, which is the asymmetry or the disjunction between theorizing fascism or rethinking or revising the histories of fascism, right? In a longer delay, in an international perspective beyond European conceits and exceptionalisms, and the histories and practices of anti-fascism, right? And there's something what I found really rich and challenging in this conversation is, you know, in a sense the proposal seemed to me at least implicit to think, and I got this also from Dian's reference to Ruthie's change everything watchword motto, the notion of the need for a kind of deeper, so to speak, anti-fascism, the sense of ways of practicing, drawing on a multiplicity of political and cultural practices to think what it is to dismantle, but to positively dismantle the things that make processes of fascisation, you know, repeat and recur, albeit in different variants. And I think that seems very important, because there is something which I also think is in some level indispensable, right? There's like a kind of antagonistic urgency to a vision of anti-fascism, which I can both totally understand and sympathize and I identify with. You know, there's a need to defend certain communities, there's a need immediately to stop, you know, horrific things from happening. But there's also a huge risk in that, right? Not least because actually in states that hold the monopoly of violence, I mean, you know, it's alas not you know, often we have recourse, right, to and sometimes inevitably, right, to security services and forces of order to police and prevent you know, extremism and radicalization and so on, right? So there's a very complex question, I think, today about not just what an anti-fascist future would look like, but what is anti-fascist practice in the present, which I think this conversation has illuminated also in its extremely challenging, right, character. And I think one of the texts that I briefly mention is a piece by Stuart Hall from the late 70s, where, you know, he mentions that there's a kind of comfort, right, for the left in anti-fascism, because, you know, fascists are recognizable, repugnant, and they should be stopped at all costs, right? And so that has a very attractive, simplifying effect, some of the manipulations of which I think Nicole dealt with really brilliantly in also like a more geopolitical context, right? But I think that's the extremely tricky thing to negotiate, both at times the urgency and immediacy of self-defense, as it were, and of antagonism, and then the other hand, the fact that if you leave it at that, then actually you just contribute to just the reproduction or the continuation of something whose deeper dynamics you're not addressing in the least, right?
I don't have too much to add, but just that the conversation across each other, I mean, to sort of pick up the sort of the struggle of anti-fascist futures is the interconnections between racial formations. So like the struggle for indigenous sovereignty plus like Black freedom struggles, the diaspora, you know, so for me, it's sort of like, those are complicated relations that I think are often treated as distinct social formations or relations of force. And as we're talking sort of across and through them together, right, I think it shows what are anti-fascist futures when all of these things are interconnected, and like indigenous sovereignty is intimately connected to Black freedom, right? And so I think that makes it, you know, on the one hand more complicated, and I mean that's life is complicated, and at the same time, right with political possibility in terms of coalitional formations, and so I think that's the sort of exciting part, and also I recognize that the way that we've approached these kinds of formations has been in deeply siloed ways, or like add and stir kind of method of like, well, I'm fighting for this and it's kind of connected to this, right? I think about, for example, like struggles around like upending domestic terrorism policies in the US often being treated as disconnected from the war in Afghanistan, for example. And what does it mean to think through those things together and actually as a part of the same, racial logic, relations of force, and so on. And so, yeah, I guess that's sort of what this conversation is sparking for me, is that we're all deeply located in our own political projects, and we can also see how they're interconnected and intimately tied to one another.
Maybe just briefly following on that, I think there's also something very symptomatic about the fact that a lot of the most extreme ideations and totalizing theories of the far right or of the fascistic right have as their core a kind of panic about coalition, right? I mean, in the 1930s, when Oswald Spengler, who was very influential in Mussolini inter alia, writes this book called The Hour of Decision, right? And he writes this book, and the whole book is structured around this notion, which then Mussolini in an anonymous review, whilst already leading his fascist regime in 1933, says, well, this is exactly right. He says, well, what's the problem? The problem is that there is this thing called the white world revolution, which is basically Bolshevism. And then there is, the colored world revolution, right? And the panic, which is a panic which is also very much explicitly stated in demographic terms, and there's nothing new about so-called Great Replacement theory, given that it was pretty much invented by American eugenicists in the 1920s. And that's the panic, right? The panic is about the interlocking of everything that is threatening this extremely restricted, possessive, masculinist, fetishistic kind of notion of politics. So I think there's, I think there's something, to my mind, also very peculiar, right, about the imaginary of contemporary fascism is, in a sense, also an imaginary of hegemonic and coalitional practices that the left hasn't actually managed to engage, fully to engage in. It's as if, it's almost suggests, that as a kind of principle to be that which they fear is already happening, but isn't really, right? But that's the kind of panic, and I find that really, really striking. I mean, I'm very clear also specifically, right, the link between anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness in the whole circulation of this Great Replacement theory and in cultural Marxism is always about coalition. It's always, and you see these videos by Christopher Rufer, right? There's a picture of Angela Davis with Marcuse, and the narrative is basically like, Jewish communists came over from Germany in the 1930s and allied with Black women and destroyed America, right? Like that's the kind of image. But I think that, I think there is a kind of negative symptom there of the significance of coalitional, of not coalitional is probably not the right term, right? But of politics of solidarity and reflection on these different traditions of anti-fascism to contemporary struggles.
So I think Phil has a question he wants to raise for us too.
Yeah, I wondered, what do you see as the difference between fascism and original accumulation? Both involve considerable amount of violence, but perhaps fascism involves a reactionary element of looking backwards to restore some threatened and imaginary state, which is not the case in original accumulation. And in other words, put it another way, does fascism in America, or at least begin with Reconstruction and Black Reconstruction rather than with the imposition of slavery in the beginning in Virginia, or the ethnocide of Indigenous Americans, which one could call original accumulation or so forth. One of the good books on fascism, The Anatomy of Fascism by Robert Paxton, when he's kind of looking around to see proto-fascisms, he says, in America, the Ku Klux Klan is a fascist organization because it's all built restoring this kind of mythical white harmony, which is now threatened by all these lower races and stuff. I'm interested to hear everybody's. So I guess what I'm asking is it important? Does the use of the word fascism slip occasionally into just generalized violence, as opposed to a very, very specific and strange movement that occurs in at perhaps specific moments in the cycle of capitalism, or I'm not going to restrict or define those moments, but that's the question anyway.
Means very, very briefly, just because I mean, I think you can't. I think the element of mass movements and of participation, which other people have spoken about also, right, of participation and involvement in the imposition and reproduction of white supremacy or settler colonialism in the States, the mass movement, the democratic dimension, right, of fascism, right, because I think that's also, fascism is something that emerges in the context of, right, mass politics, mass movement politics, in distortions and perversions of that, etc. But so I think, you could say, okay, well, in some sense, fascism is, racial capitalism in the context of mass politics, and indeed in the context of various forms of capitalist crisis. So I think it would be problematic to my mind, I mean, to link it, to spread it to any form of state capitalist violence, because then I think it really loses kind of any specificity. But I think, in a sense, from the late 19th century on, across the age of empire, let's say, and the age of social imperialism, that is to say, of democratic buy-in by labor aristocracies in metropolitan white countries into imperialism, I think that it's all, the elements are already, in a sense, in place. And in that sense, the point that Paxton makes about the KKK, I think, is kind of not non-controversial for me in terms of the militia mass element of fascist violence.
I would just say, I mean, again, there's a, oh, I didn't mean to cut. Anyway, I'll just say quickly. I mean, I think there's a danger anytime sort of like you start to apply one term sort of across all history or whatever, there's that. But I think that, as Alberto was talking about, the sort of the mass movement, the democratic kind of element of it is really crucial. And in that sense, we could talk about the so-called founding of the United States as very much that, because you have state formation linked to kind of deployment of militias, both formal and informal. That is a kind of so settler colonization in that sense very much follows as a certain kind of. I don't know that there's much to be gained from arguing that the formation of the United States is itself a fascistic formation, but I think that one can see an important genealogy there and an important history without necessarily. I mean, I think. Again, the point that Nicole makes about what's obscured, what's made difficult to see by using the term fascism is really important to keep in mind. That's something that Anne Spice's contribution, as Dian gestured to also, is really important in the collection of saying Anne writes in her chapter that she is hesitant to use the term fascist because it so often using that obscures the sort of the long history of indigenous anti-colonial struggle. And so I think there's sort of, I think what we're trying to do in the collection is actually to sort of see in what way does the kind of heuristic, the kind of lens of fascism as an analytic, allow certain conversations to kind of unfold, while also not trying to kind of pin it down such that it can do the work like that both Nicole and Anne specifically are speaking about, that so that actually the language of fascism does as much to sort of shut down or police a certain what is properly included and not included. And so the collection, I think, across the chapters is an effort to kind of hold in tension those things. So that's to say, I mean, original accumulation is that, I mean, is the violence that is ongoing, right? I mean, the whole point of so-called primitive accumulation or original accumulation that I think and many people have made, Harvey, et cetera, is that this is not a historical moment. It's an aspect that is held in the constant reproduction of capitalism itself. And the same is true within liberalism, right? That liberalism disavows, in many ways, the kind of most brutally pronounced forms of violence, and that it relies upon to maintain its own regimes of power. So it's maybe not important to say liberalism is the same as fascism, but there are ways in which to say those things are entangled in really important ways.
Yeah, I agree. I was trying to remember how Coulthard had put it, but basically we're still this originary extraction is still going on strong across the globe, but specifically in North America right now, because our folks are in the middle of it. And that, but he makes a different distinction, and I'm not remembering out of, and I was hoping Alyosha might, but he makes another distinction about how we are positioned to that at this point, because we're not positioned to it in the same way as everybody else is, because we're still experiencing it. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to pull that out of my aging brain right in a second, but I'll jot it down and go after it later and email you or something. But the other thing that you brought up about fascism, somebody did just a second ago, that I think has always thought was really interesting is the way in which the population itself has always been a militia. That from the get-go, in the formation of the United States, that the citizens were told, that the rightful citizens of the new republic that had formed itself had actually constituted itself out of nothing. I mean, if you look at, like, where was there, what I'm saying, who gave them permission? Maybe it was Terranelius, or maybe it was a papal order or whatever, but basically there wasn't, it formed, it was a magic formation without an authority. And but one of the first things that it did was it initiated the right to bear arms. Okay, and I don't want to avoid the conversation about that today. Okay, the right to bear arms, and that at this point in time, it might be extremely important to think about that, because what I've experienced of militias, both in urban and rural communities where I've lived, is that they don't necessarily have to be organized. They are made up of the citizens around you who are always actually policing non-white populations or othered populations. And when they can organize, they can quicken in a moment and become something that looks more organized and have all these cute names and stuff, Proud Boys, or all this stuff and everything. But for people who lived in carceral spaces, on reserves and reservations, we know them very well, because they're what actually police are at all times, our peoples, and make borderlands where there were just relations before. And that also these folks actually take the place of a police force, so that the police force actually can be freed up, you know what I'm saying, to actually do nothing, or they can create, the police state in this case, or the carceral state, can create all these absolutely fantastical jurisdictions over our lands, which allows extraction to come, people to extract from us completely, like extract all the resources from that place, never leave any or build any infrastructure, and leave whole areas in which we are impoverished and ill and not able to, take care of ourselves there any longer, all with the help of the locals, The locals can also help us build. So, I'm not going to leave it at, just this one dire, example, but I'm saying that many people have written about this. We were trying to figure out exactly how it works at the level of the citizen and these militias, because the militias, everybody's so surprised about the militias, but it's not. It's like that's what authorizes this 18-year-old white boy from white suburbia to walk into a black neighborhood and wantonly kill everybody in sight. And we know this is not going to be the last time. I mean, the killing at this point is so. I that's, to me, the fascism. The fascism is built into the fabric, and it's built into the fabric and realized in the liberal belief in the right to kill wantonly, apparently.
It certainly seems to be distinctive to America to have this kind of militia tradition, which adapts so easily to become a strong element of fascism, with the National Rifle Association and all that stuff, putting it in. One doesn't find that, I think, in Germany, where there is no tradition of that, but there are these veterans after World War I who become part of a right-wing Freikorps, which is a mercenary company that's maybe the crucible out of which many fascists emerge. But I do think the one thing that Alberto said about this thing about being a mass movement and fascism being an element of mass politics, that that's precisely the puzzle of fascism, where it raises the question: why do people struggle for their own servitude? The old Etienne from the from the Renaissance. Fascism appeared as a mystery when it first came in. People couldn't explain why this is happening, because they knew that the mass should be part of the left, but it wasn't. So I mean, I don't think we can ever lose that element of mass politics when we're trying to decipher and struggle with fascism. I don't know. That's just
No, that's a great point. I mean, in my essay in particular, one of the things I look at is actually the formation of the mob, and this is something that someone like Jack Forbes does when Jack Forbes is a kind of indigenous studies scholar out of UC Davis. He has this essay on fascism in the 80s, and he's trying to think about what is it that connects all these disparate formations of authoritarian violence, and how to put them in a historical conversation or historical pattern. And for him, he looks at the mob. So he's like, the formation of the mob isn't just this frenzied army of true believers. It's actually a mode of expressing some type of devotion, right? And so for Forbes, then he's able to locate the mob formation in terms of the proto religious empires of Europe, to the kind of settler mobs that are the militias that are forming in settler societies, to even to the contemporary conjuncture in which union busting and slaveholding unions have become resurged, right? So this question of the mob, right, is actually also happens in a moment when a principle of reality by a ruling party, by the state, is actually willfully destroyed, right? So there's state derealization happens, right? So what's true is you cannot verify the truth, and so what happens is devotion, right? It's not necessarily irrational, but it's a kind of aesthetic effect, almost it's an effect of encountering images. It's an effect of encountering some type of kind of, I would say image, or I would say stick with an image to kind of think about that, the relationship between fascism and imagery. But yeah,
that reminds of Walter Benjamin's comment that fascism doesn't offer anything to its adherents except the ability to express themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the point also, which is crucial in this, and I was thinking about this in terms of Diane's comments about the direct policing, right, or the deputizing of these functions of violence that I think there is, and it's probably underestimated. Certainly in German Nazism, much more than in Italian fascism, there's a definitely very strong anti-statist dimension to fascism in the specific sense of a form of racial petty sovereignty, which involves the direct use of violence by people on the basis of their identity as directly expressive and bearers of a national and racial project, but which breaks from the notion of a kind of ordered bureaucracy, and I think we miss a lot if we don't realize and recognize that actually it was a very profound strain within especially Nazi thought, and Franz Neumann got this in Behemoth very well, which is not at all Schmittian. It was not at all about the state. It was about this form of extremely violent conception of freedom, of freedom as the freedom to engage in exclusionary, exterminationist violence on the basis of a kind of racial identity. And therefore, there was also, I think, in Germany, a huge fantasy of how to be a settler colony, and how to be a settler colony and no longer a European state in this legacy of absolutism and centralized bureaucracies and so on. And I think that element is really important also to grasp some of the fantasy formations with their grim realities of the far right, which we don't understand if we remain stuck with a kind of liberal conception of totalitarianism, whereby fascism is just the cult of the state that dominates everyone, which it's actually not. It's also it's a very disturbing promise of racialized conceptions of freedom, and we of course see that in what is a mystery, but is not a mystery at all, which is the mix of so-called libertarianism and extreme authoritarianism and violence, which has this notion of a racialization of freedom, I think, as at its core. And so I think those, in that sense, those North American histories are extremely relevant, as they were also relevant, incidentally, for Nazi legal thinking, which was initially trying to use legislation about Native Americans in the US as its basis for removing citizenship from Jews and Romani and others, to have people who are nationals but not citizens. It was like, oh, they figured out how to do this in the US, let's implement this in Europe. So the links are really deep, both at the juridical and at the ideological level, right?
I know that we're about to wrap up, but if I could just make one comment. I just wanted to say that I think in all of this, I don't want to exceptionalize North America too much. And I really want to kind of conceive of these circulations of fascistic politics through a kind of international of settlerism. And so I think that it's really important, for example, to look at, apartheid South Africa and look at the kind of ossification of Afrikaner nationalism. And the kind of, on one hand, the kind of intense centralization of Afrikaner ethno-power, as well as the kind of like individual deputization for other Afrikaners, for other whites who were beneficiaries, active participants in apartheid, to enact violence onto Black, colored, indigenous, other people, as well as the kind of movement between settler states, right? The mercenaries that were actively recruited in North America after Vietnam, who came to fight in apartheid South Africa, as well as in Rhodesia. The relationships also between Israel and South Africa, Israel's participation in the apartheid government squashing of indigenous, kind of the anti-apartheid movements, as well as the kind of mob violence that we do see in Israel, and the active theft of Palestinian homes, lands that has been ongoing since the Nakba and the establishment of the state. And so just to kind of internationalize like these formations, because there is, as I was talking about earlier, with what Dorian Bell calls like racial scalarity and the kind of reuse the scaling up, scaling down, the kind of translation of different forms in order to resolve the kind of demographic question that any given settler state kind of is trying to eliminate, resolve, or whatever the kind of goal is for the project.
That seems like a perfect place for us to end. I don't know if Phil, you wanted to offer a
well, I
final
just want to
comment?
say thank you. This is, of course, one of those discussions that one doesn't want to end, because fruitful ideas keep coming out every minute or so that require thought. But do buy the book, everybody. I think it's real thick and it's a bargain. It's up on my right table, my table. I would go read it right now, but I have to read some more Brecht plays because I'm supposed to talk about it in 2 days. So we'll see. But do come back. Come back when we're live at some time in the future, which is hopefully next year. And thank you, Alyosha and Malav and everybody, Alberto, for putting it together. And Zoe, Simon, and Dian, who is actually a neighbor. I just figured out at the University of Washington. So meeting in the flesh is not impossible there. Terrific panel. And to all the people who are viewers, who are broadcasting, who are watching the broadcast, we have another one at 3:00 on the unipolar moment, the famous Fukuyama fiasco, which deluded so many American foreign policy makers for many years that they botched a lot of things. And you can come and hear from legitimate IR people why even within the own terms of that discipline, they really made stupid moves. So goodbye, everybody, from Red May, and come visit us again.
Thanks so much.